Should women be required to register for the draft? Commission likely to recommend big changes. There's something really funny about this whole story is that there are a lot of feminists who tweeted out, okay, hold on. I gotta back up. There was a story a while ago that they actually said women would have to be registered for the draft, and then apparently it got reversed or it didn't get passed through. And all of a sudden we saw a wave of feminist Twitter accounts saying, I didn't sign up to be a feminist for this. No, men can keep the draft. Yes. Feminism, equality means women must serve in the draft same as men. I don't know if it's the right thing to do because I recognize there is a physical difference between men and women, and men have more bone density, more muscle mass, much less likely to be injured, especially their legs, when doing physical activity, and thus it makes sense for combat situations that we shouldn't have women in the draft. However, I also recognize that the draft doesn't always mean combat. And this is one of the really interesting things about this story, because one of the reasons why they said no to women being in the draft is because women weren't eligible for combat, but that makes no sense because I believe most of the armed forces is non-combat. I believe combat is very specific and you have more support roles. You've got people like, I believe Nathan Phillips, right, the Native American from Covington, I believe he was a refrigerator repairman. So, he didn't serve in Vietnam. We know that's true now. He wasn't in combat or anything like that. He fixed refrigerators. Okay, so I'm not saying women should be relegated to the task of fixing our refrigerators. I'm just saying there are non-combat jobs women can be doing when the draft comes. And I think it's true that like in World War II, women were working in factories and stuff. So hey, maybe there's public service requirements. But anyway, let's read the story. 3 years ago, Congress created a commission to help it answer a pair of questions. Is the Selective Service System, which requires 18-year-old men to register for a potential military draft, working? If so, should it be expanded to include women? The panel, more than halfway through its work, is asking even bigger questions. Should draft registration be mandatory, voluntary, or eliminated? Should it target people with specific technical, medical, or language skills in addition to combat capability? Kind of like what I was saying. And should compulsory service be limited to the military, or should it include other forms of community service? I think you could definitely do other forms of community service, especially if you have someone who's a conscientious objector. Like, so if you end up with a draft, which I completely disagree with the draft, don't get me wrong, but if let's say, World War III breaks out, at that point, then it's kind of like, there's certain things about the draft I recognize, right? I'll say this. The idea of conscription, of forcing people to fight in a war, I think is wrong. However, and the main reason is because of Vietnam, right? You basically have this conflict on foreign soil that doesn't impact to an extent America, and we now know the Gulf of Tonkin incident was, I'll say false flag. I think that's the actual way they framed it in the media, but that essentially a U.S. ship claimed it was attacked when it wasn't. That got a bunch of young people sent into a war we probably shouldn't have been in the first place. So that's why I disagree with it. However, if a bunch of Russians or Chinese, military started storming the beaches of South Jersey, yes, I would be one of the first people to stand up to defend this land from a foreign invasion, right? And that's what's the important thing when you talk about conscription. If someone's going to come here and try and destroy our way of life, we need to fight back. We need to band together. Agreed. I think a lot of people would agree with that. I even think the far left, to an extent, would agree with that too, especially if it was the Russians. But the idea of forcing people into a draft when we don't know why we're fighting, that's a problem. But anyway, the point I was trying to make, the reason I said all that is because theoretically, if someone said, I refuse to fight, I refuse to kill, it's like, okay, community service. How about you cook stew in a kitchen? And that way you're providing food for certain people. That maybe. The National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service will deliver an interim report Wednesday that hints at the breadth of its charge but gives few clues as to how it's going to resolve the most controversial issues. Personally, I don't think we'll remain with the status quo, Commission Chairman Joe Heck said, but where we end up on the spectrum is yet to be determined. Heck. It's not saying Heck. Heck's his name. A retired brigadier general and Republican former congressman from Nevada called the question of whether women should be required to register for the Selective Service on turning 18 visceral. And you go ahead and comment and let me know if you think women should as well. Well, and the reason I ask that is because I know there's going to be a lot of people who say if women want equality, they should do this, but there are going to be a lot of people saying women aren't going to be able to serve to the same capacity as men, so again, you can comment. When we pose this question to people, it's not like they say, oh, let me stop and think for a minute. They have an answer, he said. Either it's yes, women should have to register just on the basis of equality, or no, women should not have to register because they have a different role in American society. In 2017, the Pentagon argued in favor of keeping the selective service system and expanding it to include women. It would appear imprudent to exclude approximately 50% of the population, the female half, from availability for the draft in the case of a national emergency, the Pentagon said in the report, which was released under the Freedom of Information Act. The military said it's committed to an all-volunteer force and doesn't have plans to implement a draft, but expanding the draft to include women would help by doubling the number of recruiting leads, officials argued, and foster a sense of gender inclusion in the national defense. The Commission's review is the most expansive examination of the draft system in U.S. history. Its conclusions are only advisory. Whether to implement them would be up to the President and Congress. Congress has been divided. Lawmakers created the commission in 2016 after the House refused to go along with a Senate proposal, supported by both conservative defense hawks and liberal feminists, to expand the draft to women. President Barack Obama, in his last weeks in office, came out in favor of a gender-neutral draft in response to a question from USA Today. Congress, unable to resolve the issue, did what it often does, created a commission to study the question. With a multi-year budget of $15 million, the 15-member panel is immune to the partial government shutdown. The commission is taking on a debate that's been brewing for generations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, citing a shortage of nurses, proposed drafting women in his 1945 State of the Union address. The draft was suspended at the end of the Vietnam War in 1973. When President Jimmy Carter reinstated draft registration in 1980, he proposed adding women. Congress disagreed. In 1981, the Supreme Court decided 6-3 that male-only draft registration was constitutional because women weren't eligible for most combat roles. Last year, a federal judge in Houston ruled the high court precedent might no longer apply because now women can serve in combat roles. But even outside of that, non-combat exists. Why would that be the basis of constitutionality of the draft? When you can simply say, I guess the idea is arguably that it's still not fair, it's still discriminatory. If you take a man and a woman who are completely equal in every way and say the guy's got to go shoot at people and the woman's got to be a nurse, that's not fair for either, especially when you consider there may be some women who are more capable than some guys. It's absolutely true. There's going to be some tiny, scrawny little dudes who are weak and some big, burly women who are very strong. Why should gender be the basis of which you can or can't enter combat? So, the decision kept alive a lawsuit. The decision kept alive a lawsuit brought by the National Coalition for Men, which represents 2 draft-eligible men challenging the sex-based draft. We take no position on whether there should or should not be selective service, said the men's lawyer. We all would have disagreements about that. What we are concerned about is the sex discrimination against men, and we oppose that whether or not there's a draft. So they say Edward Hasbrouck, an anti-war activist, was jailed for 4 months in the 1980s for refusing to register for the draft. The prosecutor in the case, Robert Mueller, who became FBI director and is the special counsel investigating Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Wow, isn't that interesting? The commission was created as a stalling tactic, he said. It may come back with recommendations that are completely ignored. Hasbrouck is one of more than 25,000 people who signed a petition urging the commission to end the draft. I think any objective, serious examination of the last 40 years of the draft registration would conclude that draft registration has failed, he said. It cannot be enforced. There's no reason to think it can be salvaged by expanding it to women. But let me ask you now. We've talked about men and women in the draft, but I think we need to ask the core question, is the draft acceptable at all? I believe in a liberal democracy it's not. But however, there's a serious conundrum. Was Vietnam wrong? In my opinion, absolutely. And they put a bunch of young kids in this combat situation. It didn't work. You ended up with a bunch of people who didn't want to be there, deserters, people were shooting themselves. It was just all around bad. And it created a crisis for a generation. What we have now is the volunteer force. How about you incentivize people to want to be in the Army? And you can do that through, they do a bunch of things. They do marketing campaigns, they do payment and things like that. Though maybe they don't pay enough, I don't know. The point is, the volunteer force is better because if someone chooses to be there, they'll take their role more seriously. But what about a real national emergency? What about if someone invaded the U.S.? Is it then appropriate? And should women be drafted alongside men? These are the important questions. Let's wrap up the basis of the story. Heck would not rule out some form of an all-inclusive service, such as devoting the last semester of high school to public service. The panel is looking at ways to promote a culture of service in which, even if it wasn't compulsory, Americans would be expected to devote at least part of their young adulthood in service. Our goal is to create what we call a universal expectation of service, Heck said, so that over the course of 1 or 2 generations, we inculcate this ethos of service so that the person who doesn't serve is the odd person out. one interesting thing. I believe it was Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, and he was with the Obama administration, I believe. He wanted everyone to go through basic training. Like, I think it was once you turn 18, you go through basic training, 3-month boot camp, basically. It's a really interesting idea. On the whole of it, I disagree because I just don't think you can force people to go through these programs. The government has no right to take someone and put them in boot camp, right? If you want to be a fat slob sitting around eating Cheetos and playing video games, that's what makes America great. But there is an interesting utility to it. Imagine the net benefit of just a 3-month training program for everybody. You'll get fit, you'll get in shape, you'll be eating healthier, and it will sharpen and strengthen people. So I see the benefits, but ultimately I would say I see it as a hell no never in a liberal democracy. If people want to do nothing, they're going to do nothing. But we got to recognize that means over time, a comfortable, wealthy liberal democracy will become weaker. It really will. Because young people aren't being challenged in the same way, and thus it may eventually just fall apart. So let me know what you think. It's an interesting debate, and yeah, stick around. I got another video coming up in a few minutes, and I'll see you then.